All right, welcome once again to Social Distillation, the submarine still of the internet, where we attempt to pour white lightning directly on your brain, your daily dose of grumpy old men, or weekly, or whatever. Uh, Before we get started, I do mean to go off on a rant here. Governor Abbott of the great state of Texas. So I watched a chunk of his news conference where he was talking about how he was rescinding the executive orders for mask mandates and business restrictions and closures. And starting Wednesday, theoretically, everything is allowed to be open 100%, and there will be no more mask mandates. And the way he delivered this, it was just pretty obvious to me this was a campaign speech. This was him trying to make sure that, because have been over the last year a lot of grumblings about people wanting to primary Governor Abbott in his reelection in 2022. And then, of course, being a governor of a large state, he's probably going to run for president in 2024. This was a campaign speech, and it ticked me off because he's delivering all this news like he's swooping in to save us. You're the one who did it in the first place, governor. Why did it take you a freaking year to suddenly realize, you know what? We can go ahead and open things up and we can eliminate these mask mandates. The numbers haven't really changed. If anything, they're kind of worse right now because we're in a winter peak. Why didn't you do this in the summer when things had gone down?
Oh, well, look, here during the summer, we had bad numbers too, because, well, summers in Texas are not like summers in Oregon. You know, the old get outside and get fresh air is different when it's 105 degrees outside. Then that's why Harris County was so high, because we're hot and humid on top of that. So everybody's inside trying to get cool, dry air. And then you saw when the winter started coming along, those colder areas, the places that get cold faster, their numbers jumped, and we started going down because we were like, oh, it's 90 degrees instead of 105. We're going to go outside now.
Yeah, our trough, instead of like midsummer, like most other areas, our trough was more like late summer, early fall when it dropped. But we did have a trough where I thought that things were going to go back to normal, and they didn't. And here comes the governor acting like he's saving us from the thing that he did. And this is, part of what we were ranting about last time.
Well, there's two big points on that, and this is for all states. First of all, I think the mask mandates were harmful because when it became a political issue, you got all the people that would do it just in spite. I got a little John Stuart Mill behind me here, just my freedom. But the other part of it was executive orders are for when there's a lack of time. And we're a year into this. We're almost at our anniversary here. We're a year into this. The legislatures have had plenty of time to decide what the path forward is going to be. Yeah. And the states haven't done that. It's been governor did this, governor did that. And at this point, the legislatures all over, and this was the problem with the elections too, the legislatures all over should have been convening, debating, and getting the will of the people, which they're supposed to represent, in the proper order. And we haven't been seeing that. So his rescinding of this order that he made, well, that should have been debated a long time ago by the legislature.
Yeah, it's part of what we were ranting about last time, of there are never any consequences. There's never any accountability. It's, you did that. One, Governor Abbott, you did this in the first place, so take some accountability. And two, where's the legislature and why do they have no huevos?
Yeah,
they should have come in a long time ago. Like I said, even if you think that these measures were appropriate as well as legal, which I find dubious on both accounts, but for the sake of argument, fine, the executive orders were perfectly legitimate as temporary measures. Where's the legislature that should have come in a long time ago and said, you know what, we need to rectify this? And it seems perfectly reasonable to me that if any sort of emergency power is enacted by an executive, that there ought to be legislation on the fact that any emergency power automatically has a 30-day expiration date and automatically convenes an emergency session of the legislature so that they can debate whatever the emergency issue is and take any legislative action that might be necessary. And we have something akin to that on the federal level with the War Powers Act, because technically only Congress can declare war. But, we realized, yeah, but there are lots of times where the commander in chief needs to send forces for some reason or another. So there's an expiration date on that where the commander in chief can send forces somewhere, but then I'm pretty sure it's a 30-day timeline, and then he has to go to Congress to ask for continued funding for whatever he's doing.
Well, and that kind of carries over from our last conversation, because we ended talking about the elites and who benefits from lockdowns, who benefits from the decolonizing math and all the things we talked about. It's the elites, because they're part of the major corporations that benefit, such as Amazon and stuff like that. They also have access to things normal people don't have, such as private tutors or private schools that are open right now. We got that head of the teachers union in California that got caught sending her kid to private school, boarding school, when she's closing down all the schools in her state. So they're still becoming educated. And so we're raising a generation of, you want to talk equity, a huge intellectual gap between middle class and below and upper middle class and above, because if you can afford it, you're getting your kids an education right now. And when we say all you want about public schools, but they're better than no schools. And realistically, the data suggests if you come out of high school reading, writing, and doing mathematics at a 12th grade level, you have every tool you need to succeed, even if you do need to do a little catching up in college. As two of us from a little podunk farm community school going to a major university, I saw the growing pains. I don't know if you did.
Yeah.
I walked into my first class, had more people in it, twice as many people as we graduated with.
Yeah.
And that was one class. That was what was that chemistry professor's name that was from New Zealand?
Klotov.
No, that was my Chem 2 professor. That was a stuttering Russian. Dr. Klotov. Yeah. He was incredibly smart, though. Just couldn't understand a word he was saying. But
yep.
Dr. Rockley. That was the first one.
He was the good one.
Yeah. But on the subject of elites, I want to talk about lizard people.
Okay.
So this is truly conspiracy theory. So when we talk about, well, what constitutes conspiracy theory, everything is misinformation. Well, for those that haven't been living under a rock, one of the things, it goes along with the QAnon. It's not exactly their mantra, but they play together very well. But that the elites of the country are blood-sucking lizard people, that can transform into regular people. And if we could just see it, we'd start seeing the signs, and you see videos where it looks like there's a lizard eye and all this stuff. It's complete and total bullshit.
Well, I don't know. There was that really good documentary with Roddy Piper about this.
Well, I got curious because I read something in a behavioral biology book, and it tickled something in the back of my mind. And we both have read a lot of Jordan Peterson and listened to a lot of Jordan Peterson. And you talk about story over time tends to be metaphorical, and some things have roots that you just don't know. And if you really break it down, it's like, oh, that was an analogy. That was a metaphor. And I traced some of the lizard people stuff way back to the ancient Greeks and the fall of Atlantis. And the fall of Atlantis, according to some legends, were the lizard people took control of the government, basically, and ruined the whole place. And it died a horrible death going underwater, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that's where a lot of these things came out of. And it was almost like a precautionary tale. Don't let the lizard people in charge. Well, what I saw in this book was the reference to sociopaths as highly intelligent lizard-brained people. Highly intelligent, but no emotion. And what we do know about sociopathic behavior is we do see a lot of that in our elected officials, because you kind of have to get through that system and make the choices that you have to make without your feelings getting involved and getting in the way. A lot of times, maybe it's a metaphor and it's a teaching point. The lizard brain versus the lizard person. What are your thoughts on that?
That I think goes a long way to explaining the appeal of something so nutty. Something that on the surface is so absolutely absurd, and yet has a disturbingly growing number of proponents or adherents. And I think there are also on these conspiracy theories, the other thing that's so worrying is like you talked about with the 4 different types of postmodernists. You have the people who aren't really postmodernists, but are kind of on the outside going, well, I kind of see the point, and that's who eventually gets sucked into doing the dirty work.
Here we go. I actually gave them names this time around. Number 1 is the activists. Is my screen up?
It says there we go.
Okay. Yeah, number 1 are the activists. And again, those are the ones that know what's meant by the critical social justice, the term systemic racism, what it actually means, the power hierarchies and how they interplay. And if you're on the top of the hierarchy, you don't even know it. So you could be racist and supporting that without even knowing it, blah, blah, blah. The misled, those are the ones that really believe things are so bad that it is systemic. So you've got so many warts, you've got a condition, right? And that's kind of the people we're going to be talking to today when we go on to the data sets. Media representation is so skewed that the average Black man would answer 1,000 if you asked him how many. We've got a graphic for this later. How many unarmed men were shot by police last year? And the answer is somewhere around 20 or 30. And actually, I have the Washington Post data downloaded to Excel, and it might be somewhere around 12, depending on what you call unarmed versus maybe slightly deadly weapons, etc. Then there's the compassionate, those that know it's being overblown by the media, but hey, it's a good cause, so we'll still support it, right? And then the beat down, those that are like, oh, it's kind of BS, but I can't say anything. And so I gave them names this time around. That way, maybe if we need to refer to them quickly, we can just give them the name. But instead of woke or social justice warriors and everything, I'm going to refer to them as the activists, because that's what they are. They're trained activists. If you've gone through the programming that they go through in the college level, then you're even inadvertently a trained activist in some ways, because you're told you have to speak out, you have to do this, you have to do that, and you see it on social media. It's easy, lazy activism, but it's there.
Yeah.
Any more thoughts on that before I go into how the brain works? Oh no, I need to go into who's the target.
Well, I had another mini rant that I thought was unrelated, but I think it's a good preamble to what you're going to talk about today. I kind of went down a YouTube rabbit hole a few days ago, and I found a Jordan Peterson interview I hadn't watched yet, which was, I don't know if you've seen this one. It's like an hour and a half with GQ Britain. It's from 2018.
No, I haven't seen that one.
And there were several things in there that just kind of made light bulbs go off. But the one that really jumped out at me is when this journalist near the end started pressing him on, oh, what are you talking about these postmodernists and activists and these Marxist revolutionaries? You're just talking about a handful of radical academics and people on campus, and yeah, they're annoying, but it's just a handful, and you're overblowing this. Okay, well, first of all, where's your data that makes you think that? Secondly, even if you're right that numbers wise, there aren't that many of them, it's important to realize they're making gains far outside their actual numbers.
Mhm.
Any casual observation of academia over the past decade will show you that it has been accelerating towards this activist mentality that you were talking about.
Well, I'll give you
And
an
then,
example in the middle of your rant, and it might direct you even further down your rabbit hole. I think it was CNN. They did there. It was an independent poll, but it was on CNN, and 9% of people support the Dr. Seuss book canceling, and 91% think it's kind of BS. And that number actually very much corresponds to the Hidden Tribes report of what percentages of people belong to which of these groups. And that's 8% is the far progressive left. And so they picked up 1% outside of their far left.
yeah.
So it's pretty much in line, but they're doing it. And we'll bring up I think it's important for today's conversation because the strategy, it is activism.
Yeah.
And this actually is very parallel to the Kaepernick discussion because there's a purpose behind what people they pick to cancel, what books they pick, what sporting events, etc. There's a purpose behind it. And when you see that, then you're kind of like, well, that's a bad faith argument. So I think we'll get into that later, but if you finish your rant and then I'll go into the mental state stuff.
Well, that was mostly it. It's just important to remember that we're not saying that postmodernist lizard people have taken over the world. We're saying that the noise they're making is pushing culture and politics into a very radical space and creating a very sharp schism within the country because of their rhetoric, because of their ability to manipulate people to going along with them, even if that mob, if they took a step back and thought about it, wouldn't actually agree with the activists.
And we're talking about postmodernists and how it's playing into it. I think it's important to point out where they were correct and then where they went off the rails. One thing they did get right was actually their central tenet, which their only truth that they accept as a universal truth is that power is everything, and power determines everything, and hierarchies are how that power is distributed and who controls what. Where they go off the rails is thinking that you can eliminate that, because if you destroy one hierarchy, it's just going to be replaced by another one. And when you're talking about the elites, they're manipulating that fact. They want some things to be torn down so they can build it back in, because who has the influence and who has the quote unquote power to build it their way? The people who have the more money, the more influence, the more reach. So we talk about social media and the public square, who's kicked off, who's not, who has the more reach, who determines the knowledge, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So those that have the resources will end up having the power. And I think with the way things are being pulled apart now, they're done in the name of equity, but it's going to result in a greater divide amongst the elite versus the normal people than we originally had with the liberal order. And that I think is why a good enough reason in itself to speak up. So at least we're doing that. But we're trying to reach today the 2s and 3s on our list. Let me share my screen again, because one misunderstanding in this whole narrative is that white supremacists, as we think of them, Nazis and neo-Nazis, skinheads, KKK, etc., are the target of the protests, but they're not. The target of the protests are normal, apolitical people that just want to go about their business. Is my screen up?
Yeah.
All right. So white America. If you don't know who's responsible for racism, look in the mirror. It's actually quite a well-written article from the Chicago Tribune. And she goes into how normal white people trying to just live their daily life are the problem. In fact, she spells it out. She says, this is a racist person. I'm not talking to you. I'm not talking to them. I'm talking to you. So if you're one of those, oh, I just let people live and I treat everybody equally, etc., you're the target of the protests. And because that's not clear, everybody falls in line and says, oh yeah, I'm fighting for this, when they don't even know what they're fighting for. They're fighting against themselves and they don't even know it. So I think that's an important point for people to understand, because now you start to look at things a little differently. So I just wanted to bring that up before I go into the what Heath calls the witchcraft, the brain science. Anything you want to add to that before we?
Well, anyone who knows anything about the rise of authoritarian regimes should know that you will be made to care, and that should be chilling. That should be chilling to anyone who doesn't want to end up there. Go read 1984. You had to enthusiastically participate. I think I mentioned this in one of our previous ones about the time in the USSR where people stood for like 45 minutes giving a standing ovation to Stalin's favorite symphony, because everyone was afraid to be the first person to stop clapping. Okay, that how do you not see the direct correlation here? You have to stand up and be with the activists, or they will get you. I mean, that's what's being said here, and that's what we have seen has been done.
While you're saying that, I brought up a little graphic here. This is a real thing. So again, if you didn't know you were the target of the protest, there's some information. The people behind it, this is how they think. This is an extreme example, I'm gonna say, but it's a powerful example. It's the BLM Toronto founder. So BLM has lots of sectors around the country, just like you would have franchises, basically. And this is a person with a lot of influence. And this is, again, it's not, this isn't a lie. This is her own posting right here. This, we'll get to that later. All right. So couple things on the brain science. First of all, I'm going to come down on the liberals here. And the key to not acting unconsciously is to be aware of what you can do unconsciously. And I was reading Moral Landscape with Sam Harris, and he brought up a study talking about conservative versus liberal bias. And for those that don't know what the trolley problem is you usually it involves a trolley or a train going down a track, and you pull the switch to determine which way it goes. And on one side is, say, your mom, and on the other side is 10 people, 10 random people you don't know. Which way do you pull the switch? So this problem has been used to study a lot of different things with decision making amongst people. And here's a study he pointed to: motivated use of moral principles. And I read the study because I wanted to make sure he wasn't misrepresenting it. But I'm going to read directly from Moral Landscape. Conservatives prove less biased by race than liberals, and therefore more even-handed. Liberals, as it turns out, were very eager to sacrifice a white person to save 100 non-whites, but not the other way around, all the while maintaining that considerations of race had not entered their thinking. And it's true. What they did was they gave clues that it was an ethnic person versus not, like his name was Tyrone versus Chip or something like that. And and the number was 100 on the other side. So you say one black person or one guy named Tyrone or 100 people named Chip on the other side. And the liberals were biased towards saving the one black man versus the 100 white people. And that's something we've got to be aware of, because I mean, it's not an easy decision. Nobody wants to kill anybody, but it's not an even-handed decision too. And the awareness of that is, like I said last time, we have to, compassion is a resource too. And the trolley problem is great for this because you're picking where your compassion goes. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, you see the tangible, well, two thoughts. First, you see the tangible results of this. And this was kind of my preamble rant of, look, it's not that postmodernist lizards have taken over the world. It's that even with small numbers, they can push much larger numbers into doing terrible things, because this played out over the summer with the BLM riots that were mostly peaceful protests. I'm sorry. Billions of dollars in damages, hundreds injured, and dozens dead.
But for a good cause.
But for a good cause.
Yeah.
And it went on like all summer. And you saw that the leftist politicians and even not just the politicians, but the culture and the commentators, normal people on social media, were continually willing to excuse this behavior, even though it was hurting real people. Real people were being killed. Real people were having their livelihoods destroyed. And yet it was excused.
Mm-hmm. Well, and nobody even paid attention to who was losing this. It wasn't me. It wasn't middle-class white America. We could lose our jobs now in the current environment or something like that. But when it came to the actual protests and riots resulting from them, it was inner city minority America, and all minority America. It wasn't Mark Zuckerberg. And so I was presented the other day a CNN article, and this wasn't in the plan, but it's relevant here. That was based on another book, and part of the premise was how racism hurts the white community. And I think I'll need to read that, but I've got so many reading assignments right now. But at the same time, the premise of today's talk from my end is how critical race theory and the resulting activism hurts the Black community. And again, compassion. Do I have compassion for someone that's claiming microaggressions? Or do I have compassion for all of those people that lost their businesses, lost their livelihoods, all the children that died in the situation? Was it Jason Whitlock? I always forget his first name.
Yeah,
Jason Whitlock. He did a whole episode of Outkick just reading the names of 14 years old and younger children that have died this last year during all of this. And not directly results of the riots, but results of autonomous zones, places that are defunded police, the riots themselves, just the anger that comes out of it, which we're going to go into later. It actually has a name. It's called the Ferguson effect, aptly named. But let's talk about the human mind, because these are important. The first one is I got a book behind me, The Happiness Hypothesis by Jonathan Haidt. He's one of the co-founders of Heterodox Academy, and he's a social psychologist by trade, one of the top in the country. But he describes the unconscious mind and the conscious mind as like an elephant and its rider. So the rider is the conscious mind, the elephant is the unconscious mind. The problem with that is a rider on an elephant can't make that elephant do anything. If I just start poking an elephant to go one way, it's probably going to bump me off and stamp me. So what an elephant rider does over the course of time is trains the elephant that where the rider wants him to go is where it wants to go. And so through constant diligent training, the elephant thinks what the rider wants is the best thing for itself. And so if we're talking about emotions versus logical thinking, emotions will win every time unless you train your brain to react in a way that is best for you. And we can do this with exercise. When you first start exercising, if you don't have consistency from the beginning and train your mind to actually want or feel like it needs that exercise, eventually you're going to have that burnout and fall off. You see, you're oh, I got a reunion coming up, I need to get in shape. Oh, motivated for about 5 weeks, and then everything goes and you end up in a yo-yo kind of dieting system, motivation versus dedication. And so, but once you've done it long enough, and once you've trained your brain, when you miss a day, you feel bad. And so that's a small example of how you can train your unconscious mind. Just developing good habits is another example of that. You know, I read an hour every day. Okay, so you read an hour every day for long enough, then it becomes something that you feel bad if you miss it. And the problem is if you don't become aware of how your unconscious mind is being manipulated or poked, prodded, that elephant can be poked, and you just move along with the elephant versus the elephant moving along with you. And what we see a lot with humans in general is post hoc justification for what the elephant did versus having the elephant do what you wanted to do. And I think that's where we're at right now as a nation. Is we've got at least over 50% of it having a post hoc justification of the emotional response to things like George Floyd video or something like that. The second thing I wanted to go into, so the 2 points on the mind, is implicit bias. This is something you see a lot when you have the racially charged conversation, is ultimately, no matter what data you have, you get thrown back at you eventually. Are you sure you're just not biased? Are you sure you're just not implicitly biased? And that has two meanings from the social justice camp, from the activists. One is that postmodern, your place in the hierarchy determines your knowledge and how your brain works. So therefore, if I'm on the top of the hierarchy, I'm going to think and say things that keep me on the top of the hierarchy, whether I know it or not. So there's the metaphysical one from the postmodernists. But the other part is there is some science that you do have implicit bias, which is it's adaptation. New things can be scary, and so something new to your mind triggers the anxiety response and the fear response. And there is good studies that if someone's shown a face of a different race, the brain lights up in those centers. So these studies are being used to say, look, see, bias exists. You can't help it, and you're doing it. And so therefore, that's the lead-in drug to the postmodern view of bias. So you can't help your own bias, and that's why we're saying your hierarchy, your socialization says you can't help it.
Which is frustrating and disturbing, because so you're taking out free will, which is, you know, basically the foundation of our society, is that you are responsible for your actions. Oh, well, no, I'm not. Okay, well, then what are the consequences of that? If I'm not responsible for my actions, then how can they be held against me?
Well, the free will debate is pretty fun if you get into like Sam Harris, Sapolsky, Jonathan Haidt, all those guys discussing what is free. Well, that's the problem. Some of them say there is no free will. It's weird that nowadays the atheists are the ones that say there's no free will. And they argue with the religious people on that. But it's really, to me, I think it's the wrong argument, because it's like, where do you cut off what is free will? You know, because we do have those things in our brain, our unconscious brain that has been being conditioned since we were young. So like the IAT, I aced that thing from the racial standpoint. I was not implicitly biased from it, but I also lived in Lamarck for 6 years, where I was the only white person on the street. And we grew up near South San, we're mostly Hispanic. So we had a diverse upbringing to some degree. And what we see with implicit bias studies, the continuation of the studies on that, is it's so flimsy that your social norms actually have a greater impact than just our immutable characteristics. So having been, living in a Black community for a long time, working with athletes a lot, which gives you a higher percentage of skewed number compared to population, there is no reactionary component to it in my brain because I'm around it all the time. So when I see something like 2-year-old anti-racist training, I'm like, oh God. But the other part of my brain says, if it's just a bunch of interracial people getting their kids together and playing, that actually works. Because now you're taking that internal brain fire and creating a different norm for it. So now something that might trigger them wouldn't be the different skin color because they grew up around it. And so, yeah, if that's what you're saying by anti-racist training for kids, great. But if it's reading Anti-Racist Baby by Ibram X. Kendi, no, we're not going to go down that route, because now you're talking power dynamics and stuff and trying to brainwash a kid from a very young age. Some of the follow-up studies, just to show how flimsy it is if you took somebody who failed the IAT with just the faces, so just the faces of different races, but then you put those faces with different shirt colors on. So you had half of them randomly distributed, black, white faces, but half of the white, half of the black had a yellow shirt, half of the black had, half of the white had a gray shirt on. They started reacting to the shirt color instead of the face. Or if you put baseball caps on and you had interviewed them in the pre-interview about what teams they liked, the faces with their team on it were fine, and the faces with the rival team on it lit up those centers. So something as small as what sports team I like is enough to override the racial bias in most people, unless it's ingrained, like you have had a childhood where they did raise you to be white supremacists or black supremacists or whatever. So these little things were enough to override that system.
It makes me think of something that I'd been meaning to point out is I think that is illustrative of the fact that racism by color, by skin color, is uniquely American. If you look around the world, there is loads of racism everywhere. The stuff that the activists rail about, that happens around the world, in most of the rest of the world. In fact, if you look at how the ethnic Chinese are treated in Indonesia or Malaysia, for example, or even within China, how the Han Chinese are treated versus the other ethnic Chinese minorities. The Balkans, if you just know the name, even if you don't know the history or can't pick it out on a map, you know the name as a region of constant violence and struggle and upheaval. And anyone in America who looked at the people in the Balkans would say they're all a bunch of whiteys, except to them they're not, because it's not about skin color. It's about tribe. It's very tribal. It's which one is one of the things that just reflexively drives me crazy about postmodernist philosophy is it's nothing new. It's nothing revolutionary. In fact, it's incredibly regressive, because for the overwhelming majority of human history, might has made right, and our associations have been tribal. And it's always been tribe versus tribe, trying to destroy the other one, not work with, but destroy the other tribe and subjugate it so that we can prosper, so that my tribe can prosper.
Again, hierarchies and power struggles. And the great thing about the liberal order in America is we have, it's the American experiment is trying to, and this is, you can compare it almost hand in hand with the French Revolution because they were so close in timeline, is the American experiment is trying to check and balance a hierarchy versus denying they exist. And even when you look at the top end of our government, we've got the three branches. And when you look at a tripod as a structure is incredibly stable, you can knock a leg out and it falls. But when we talk about a power dynamic, any leg that tries to push ends up pushing against two legs. Whereas you see something with four legs, one side tries to push, it could tip the other side over. So yeah, there are weaknesses to a tripod. Like I said, you cut one leg down, the whole thing falls. But any power push gets met by double resistance. So you have to get two on board with one ridiculous ideal to push against the one leg to have anything happen, and that's very rare. And until we meet our modern era where everything is on one side. But again, hopefully we can come back from that abyss. So where I'm going to go now with this is I'm going to bring up a lot of data because we've talked a lot about the media, and there has been a lot of deception to make a picture that pokes the elephant. And there's constant pokes of the elephant to push the American public in one direction. And they've been very successful at it. And when we see on the other side is the censorship is so that there's no poke from the other side, or the writer can't get control back. So there's pokes coming from one side, and then prevention of control coming from the other. And I think it's important to realize why the deception? Why do we need to use deception? Why is postmodern philosophy, oops, let's go back one, being used at this point? Why is it such an effective tool? First of all, this is true. If you turn off the news and go talk to your neighbor, it's pretty cool out there. So that's one thing. Reality doesn't match the narrative we're getting. But here's the other thing. This is a graphic from a large survey study, and it was about electing the president. America, as surveyed, would you elect a Black president? And as you can see, 96% of modern Americans would elect a Black president, as opposed to 1978. You see the prejudice. Only about 3/4 of the country would have elected. So over time, gay and lesbian, we got a threefold increase. A woman, 94% would vote for a woman for president. Jewish, 93%. But look there down on the bottom right. Socialist. Most of the country would not elect a socialist president. That's why Bernie Sanders inevitably fails every time, because no one really wants socialism, not even on the left. The far, far left, yes, but not even on the left. So when nobody wants something you're trying to push, you've got to poke their elephant to get there. You're not going to convince the writer. Oops. Anything you want to add to that before I go into the numbers?
Nope.
All right. So we're going to, again, just like we did with the 4 camps, we're going to use the racial example. Now, this is analogous to all of the different marginalized tools. That's a bad word, but no, it's a good word, because by the end of the day, you're going to see that to the people that matter, you are just tools. So we have 2 timelines now when it comes to the racial issue. We've got the colorblind era, which is the liberal order, and now we got the progressive anti-racist era. And the last 10 years, 2010 seems to be the boiling point where everything just started progressively going to hell. And then even accelerated about 2015, and then way accelerated with the pandemic. Now, here's an argument that the social justice crowd actually, it's probably their strongest argument, is incarceration rates in the Black community. And this is since 1989, we see a gradual increase, a very steep gradual increase up to about 2000. This is 2001. I might talk about a study later. That's why I drew that line, because that's an important date per that study. And then it keeps gradually climbing again and then starts dropping. You see a little blip circled there with a little increase in the mid 2010s. So this is probably their strongest argument, because you do see a huge spike, and most of that was in the Black community, and most of it was in response to the war, quote unquote, war on drugs, which is inherently flawed. And I think most people can agree on that now. I have a few different reasons for agreeing with that than some of the other liberal commentators. My big point is it didn't work. So we probably need to do it differently. It didn't work, and it made things worse in the Black community. Little side note, I'd like to point out that our current commander-in-chief had his hand in every one of those bills since the 1970s. So there is that. On the other side, we've got incarceration rates broken down by ethnicity, and you see everything's pretty much holding steady. Hispanics down a little bit, and then the Black community dropping pretty dramatically, which personally I'm like, yes, we're on the right track. And the other side of the aisle is like, see, look at this disparity still. That's a long debate. My personal belief is it's going down. Why didn't we just keep doing the things that kept it going down? And this is violent crime victimization rates. So we look at mid 90s again, and we see a dramatic drop all the way till about 2010, and it starts climbing back up, and we get peaks and valleys. And there's some important stuff about those peaks and valleys. On the bottom, it's broken down by ethnicity. And again, you can see where those peaks and valleys come up. Now, there wasn't a nice, pretty chart in the Bureau of Justice Statistics for the offenders. So basically, if you go back and forth with the incarceration rates, you can kind of paint a picture with the victimization rates and the incarceration rates of where the peaks and valleys are for the crime rates. So again, one of my major points, nice steady drop till about 2010. What happened in 2010 that reversed course? This is 2018 data. And this is actually where I first went after the George Floyd stuff, when I was trying to make sense of things. This is, again, violent victimization, but this also has offender data. And that's really important here. So now I have us on the screen. Does where I move us change anything?
No.
Okay, because I'm just moving it around so I can see what I need. This is what first got me thinking. The thought process after the George Floyd thing, watching the video, letting the emotions go down. Again, I didn't want any outside influence. I just wanted to look at the numbers. I just wanted to look at the data. And I read through, this was the latest available as of when I started this. Now we have 2019 numbers, and I'll bring those up because consistency is key. And one that really stood out at me was, what'd I do? I blew it up, didn't I?
Yeah.
That's all right. It's, if you look at race, ethnicity, Black, and you go over to victim per population, we have less victims than population. And I was like, oh, that's kind of crazy, because we're not getting that story. We're getting a completely different story. But we'll go into offender data later. So we're getting a completely different story. Why? How is America systemically, violently racist if it's one of the least victimized subgroups. And so that's what really got the, I need to make this smaller. So that was the first thing that kind of got my brain going down another. So then you look at the bottom chart, it breaks it down. What percentage is, so goes across racial lines.
Mm-hmm.
And well, that's important because if white people are racist, we're going to be targeting Black people, right? Well, you don't see that. Oh, this is 2019. Okay. That's what I did. I switched. Let me go back to 2018. Sorry, everybody. Me and technology don't work together well. Now it won't work.
Computer. Hello,
Oh,
computer.
computer.
Well, while you're figuring that out, this should be somewhat common sense, because if you just look around your own neighborhood, for the most part, we've kind of self-segregated ourselves. That is especially true in lower income neighborhoods. So, which is where most crime happens. So if you're going to commit a crime, it's going to be in your area for the most part, which means it's going to be around your kind of people. So that's why when you look at uh the racial component of offender and victim, they tend to kind of match up, or at least be pretty close.
Well, that was my first thought, but it gets better. Let me okay, I got it back up. Let me share it. So that was my first thought, and that's where my brain originally went. I was like, okay, well, we still do have problems, but it's pretty much along those racial lines. But until you start doing the math, and this is where that lovely skill of algebra comes in, because if you take, make sure I'm on 2018. Yes.
Yeah.
If you take victims, Black victims, and 10% of the victim number, the total victim number, right up here, is the total victims of white crime against Black individuals. And let's go ahead and make an assumption here. Every single one of them was racially motivated. It's 2.5% of all the violent crimes committed by white offenders. So if we assume every single one of them is racially motivated, 2.5% of our worst that are willing to act out on their feelings are crossing racial lines. So yes, that still plays into your narrative of people attack their own community by proxy. I heard that as one of the arguments. It's by proxy. You're closer to that because people tend to be in groups. This is where the Black on Black crime argument unhinges everything. And this is crucial. And this is not blaming the victim, people, because we're going to get to who's to blame later. This is setting up the picture. This is creating a transparent narrative versus just a narrative. The Black on Black crime argument is inherently flawed because if you just take victim data, 70% of them are Black on Black. But if you take offender data, who's committing the crime, which is important because the victim's not the racist one. Mm-hmm. The offender is the racist one. So 2.5% of white violent people we're going to just call racist, assuming they're all racist. 15% of white victims, 15% of this giant number. You see my mouse cursor, right?
Yeah.
Okay, 15% of this giant number is Black on white crime. And that actually, if you take those total numbers, offender data, that's 49% of the offenses from the Black community towards the white community. Where by offender data, 36% is Black on Black crime. So they cross that racial line. Again, this is not blaming the victim because we're going to get to the players behind it. but we have something that changes that there has to be a reason there's that big of a disparity. That's a tenfold increase in absolute numbers. We're not doing it per population. In absolute numbers, that's a tenfold increase from white on black crime to black on white crime. If you do it by population, because 12% versus 62% of the population, that's a 50-fold increase going across racial lines going that way. There's got to be something behind it. What is responsible for that disparity? It's not the poverty. Poverty is what's responsible for just the two-time crime rate versus victim rate. So poverty can be responsible for that. 2019, the only reason I had really 2019 numbers up is to show the consistency. 2018 to 2019 would pretty much were along the same trend line. Good news, total violent crime was down in 2019. Bad news, the percentages pretty much held. Let's look at why. 2010, remember that's an important year. This is media use of the word racist, racism. The nice Washington Post line spikes up. We've got a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5-fold increase of how much they use the word racist and racism since 2010. Poke the elephant, poke the elephant, poke the elephant. Some of your terms you would see more with the critical race theory, white privilege, racial privilege. Again, 5-fold or even more than a 5-fold increase by the major media outlets. Poke the elephant, poke the elephant, poke the elephant. These are all things that said over and over and over and over again until they're part of your unconscious mind. Systemic structural racism. We see it jump, and let's see, Kaepernick somewhere around right here. So we get that shooting up. Poke the elephant, poke the elephant, poke the elephant. This is just media. This is just in the major media sources. BLM, founded 2013. Again, back to that timeline. 2010 on, 2013, we see a spike. Let me go back a couple slides. Look at the patterns. Look at the patterns. Look at where the peaks and valleys are. Look at where the peaks and valleys are. And then let's go back to this. Look at where the peaks and valleys are. And when you take victim data, things stay constant, except for on the white line. And when you take offender data and incarceration rates, things peak and valley with the Black community. Again, look at those peaks and valleys. Where are they? Media, peaks and valleys. Peaks and valleys. Poke the elephant. BLM, right there at a nice little peak. Michael Brown, right there at a nice little peak. In fact, when we do talk black on black crime, we talked about the collateral damage of the protests and riots. There's a name for it. It's called the Ferguson effect. Because when you saw the after effect in Ferguson after Michael Brown, it was a huge spike in Black victimization from the Black community. Because of just how fired up people were. And how, well, you see the other part of that effect is the police don't want to get involved in those neighborhoods. So peaks and valleys, all correspondent with how the media represents things. And then we take the Michael Brown case, a lot of it was misinformation. Hands up, don't shoot. Turns out that wasn't true, but people still say it. It's in their, their elephant is hands up, don't shoot. Their mind can see the evidence that came out when it finally started to play forward, but this is CNN's story on it. Going down through the story, this is just a screenshot, but going down through the story, they were reporting as if hands up, don't shoot was the truth. This is a day after. And as a week after, it was different. And then 2 weeks after, we found more information out. And as the investigation went on, it turned out the whole narrative was incorrect. But his buddy said it, so everybody rioted.
Mm-hmm.
Poke the elephant. Big poke to the elephant. You want to add to that before we go into police?
I mean, it's just more mob mentality tactics of whipping people into a frenzy. And what the heck do you think is going to happen? I mean, when you use language that's so inflammatory, what the heck do you think is going to happen? The rational response from the people who are incensed is to fight back because they're being told their lives are literally in danger. And I would add, one of the things I would add is when you look at the timing of this, I think it's grotesquely cynical because a lot of this started to happen in 2010. What was happening in 2010? The rise of the Tea Party and the midterm elections of Obama's first term. This rise of racial language was very cynically used to insulate President Obama from criticism. What was the Tea Party? To this day, you still see people talking about how the Tea Party was all about how a bunch of white people just couldn't deal with the fact that a black man was president. It had ignoring the fact that the right had been talking for years, for decades, about the growth of government, and that's what they were talking about in the Tea Party rallies was the growth of government and government spending, which they were talking about under the George W. Bush administration too. So all of that was completely ignored, and and this racial language was used to rally the Democratic base and vilify the Republican opposition. And look at the result.
Well, yeah, that's another data point in this timeline. And when you say, well, what happened in 2010, Haidt says it's 15, but I see the pattern starting in 2010 because you get that big spike about 2013 when BLM came around. Is we have a lot of things converging. We've got the majority, not the majority. We got a very high number of university students coming into the real world that have been trained activists because they have gone through all these humanities classes that teach this, and a certain percentage of those people will follow it absolutely. And it's especially prevalent in certain industries, which we see in media is an obvious example, and that's always been that way. There's always been a left-leaning bias, but now you've got trained activists with a left-leaning bias, and that pushes them further left. The mental health industry is heavily infected with this mind parasite. APA's gone woke. Your STEM fields are the last ones, and right now they're being pushed into it because of all these other institutions that have that power. So STEM is being pushed into it. These others organically grew into it. So this is about that time. The other data point we have is Twitter, social media. Facebook's been around for a while, but it really was taking off about this time because of 4G and all of these other things that make internet easier to use and in your pocket at all times and stuff like that. So we've got those data points. We've got the Tea Party. We've got the populist movements that are starting. And that's important because we talk about the elites versus the people, and left or right, there's populist movements. Bernie Sanders is a populist movement on the left versus Trump was the populist movement on the right. And he won on the right. Bernie can't push through on the left. They're both what we would call men of the normal people. They just have different views of how to get there.
Yeah.
Bernie's obviously democratic socialist, which he truly believes, and I'll give him this, he truly believes it could actually work this time. But and then Trump was a manifestation of the frustration of the population that he just won out on the right. Had he not won the primaries, we probably would have stayed in the same kind of establishment rut we were in before that. So he popped the boil that was building. And so we've got, that's why I think 2015, 2016 are big, because this boil had been growing and he came under the picture and lanced it. And now it's a big mess. Again, poking the elephant. Poking the elephant.
And why would you not, if you're the leftist media, why would you not double down and escalate the racial language, which you can clearly see happening in 2015 for use against Trump? And he, to be fair, people on the right who love him, he didn't help himself. He stepped in it a lot. He could have thought more carefully about how he said what he said and not given so much ammunition.
Well, I'm going to go with
had
the boil example. So if you get a nice big old boil, you can get your rusty knife out and jab it, or you could you could go to a dermatologist and they'll get their sanitized materials out, control the bleeding, give it a little bit of a pain reliever, and then get that out for you. And he was the rusty knife that jabbed the boil. He was a sword that stabbed your arm.
I think a good example of that is compare and contrast his press conferences that he had when he was in the beginning of COVID, when he was so combative with the media and how he was kind of all over the place. And then look at Governor DeSantis, who's doing basically the same thing with a very biased and aggressive media in Florida. And he's punching back, but he's much more direct. He's much more direct and focused, and therefore I think effective.
Yeah. I think that's a whole conversation itself with DeSantis, because the media bias has been, and now they're kind of doing this number because of the Cuomo stuff, who they put up as their poster child. That kind of backfired at them. I made the statement before, the truth always wins.
Yeah.
Eventually there was just so much with him that they couldn't cover it up anymore. They couldn't lie. They couldn't fudge the truth enough, that they would have had to outright lie about it. And they're trying to remain at least enough credible that they can keep convincing people what they want to convince them. But yeah, I just want everybody in that. This is probably geared towards that number 2 group, because of just because of the sheer misrepresentation that we've been getting based on those graphs. We saw what was a good picture. Everything was getting better and better and better. That graph with the victimization rates, if you had time to look at the numbers, you notice we're at about a 1.4% victimization rate. That's pretty damn close to perfect. And the great news is, with the things that were
total
going on,
total
population. Yeah. The great thing is, with what was going on, is there were actually ways to make that even better, because there were disparities out there. There is still things to work on. So we could have taken that 1.4% and still continued to bring it down if we kept our rational heads about us. But now we bumped it up.
Yeah. And to the people in those second and third categories, has it made it better? The things you were complaining about, has it made it better, or has it made it worse? We're not able to have any sort of rational discussion on these racial issues. And as someone who's been following politics for way too long, it just makes me want to, give the double bird salute and say, where have you been? Because people on the right have been talking about the state of the Black community for a long time and being called racist for it. And by focusing just exclusively on race, we can't have that discussion of um, what is going on and what do we do to fix it.
Well, here's where I said I'm not blaming the victim earlier. I think I need to make that more clear here. So we looked at the media poking the elephant, and all that, and then the disparity between the white on black crime versus the black on black crime versus the black on white crime. There has to be something that accounts for that 50-fold increase going one way, and that's what got me down the path to my hypothesis that critical race theory is hurting the Black community, because it plays into it all. The only thing that stands out as the most, and understanding that implicit bias, the stuff we talked about before with reactionary anxiety and stuff with your amygdala and everything, and the fear centers of your brain, can be powerful enough to create that environment. So we've got a whole ideology that teaches young Black Americans, and getting younger and younger and younger now that they're trying to inject it in schools, that because of this hierarchy, because of this power differential existing, even people that are unconscious of it are trying to hold you down. They are trying to hurt you. Police want to hurt you. Police don't want to protect you. That white person that seems to be treating you like a friend is using you. That Black person that is successful by normal American values is also using you. And so we've got this whole ideology that trains a group of people to be suspicious, and in some ways, depending on how hard you hammer it, hateful towards another group of people. That's the only variable that accounts for that big of a disparity. That's the only thing I can find. If someone's got something better to bring to the table, let me know. But you're training a whole group of people from a very young age that everything's against them, and this is why. And it's all based on the color of your skin, and because of the color of their skin, they want it to be that way.
Bring up the slide of the BLM Toronto founder again, because this is so creepy. You look at the craziness that she's saying here, and all right, replace all the white and whiteness with Jew. I mean, this is straight up Nazism. This is, if you go back and you read Mein Kampf, or you look at what people like Goebbels were saying in his diary at the time, this was their justification. These aren't people. These are defective beings. And they need, and therefore, ... escalation, 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 escalation. How does any rational person not look at this and be immediately repulsed by this language?
Well, that's the problem. We just talked about it. We're not being rational.
Yep.
The unconscious brain is inherently irrational. That's why you have to train it down a path that thinks rationally. But there's a lot. Go ahead.
I think another thing that occurs to me is that slide there is a good illustration of what we prologued this with, which was these people are having influence way outside their numbers. I mean, the numbers show that the super radical left that's pushing all this stuff is in the single digits of percentages as far as the population goes. And yet they're able to push people into a point where we go a whole summer destroying whole cities, and people are like, well, yeah, but because you never see that. You say BLM is anti-family, and wants the destruction of the nuclear family. You say that BLM was founded by self-proclaimed Marxist activists, self-proclaimed radicals, and you're called a conspiracy theory nutcase because you never see this. You only hear the platitudes. You only see the stuff that's reasonable. You only see like the George Floyd videos that inflame your passions, no matter who you are and what your politics are, because that's a human being who's literally dying in front of you.
Mm-hmm.
That's all you see. If you would take a step back and look at that, you would go, I don't know that we want to be associated with these people. I don't know that what they're pushing is actually what they're saying.
Well, this is one of the strategies, the activist strategies, is they use the Mott and Bailey argument. The words Black Lives Matter is the Mott. It's easily defensible. Yes, Black Lives Matter. Of course, your life matters. This is not a debatable topic unless I'm either evil or a sociopath.
Yeah.
Yes, Black Lives Matter. Easily defensible. Then you jump out into the Mott. Oh, we want to destroy the nuclear family. Wait, what? Oh, retreat back to jump out into Bailey and then retreat back to the Mott. You said Black Lives Matter. Well, yeah, they do. Well, let's do this. No. Same thing we saw with Dr. Seuss and the cancel culture. It's like, oh, racism is bad. Well, yeah, racism is bad. Cancel Dr. Seuss. What? You said racism is bad. Here's one example. That's kind of pushing it, but you said racism is bad. You don't want to be seen as a racist, do you?
Right.
No, I'm not. That's a pretty big charge. Okay, we'll go along with it. So there's two parts to the Dr. Seuss. And this is part of the deception. This is part of the activism. And this is my big problem with the Dr. Seuss thing and all the cancel culture. Is the first part is the concept creep we talked about, the ever expanding definitions of the words harm. Dr. Seuss is harmful is why they removed it, or those 5 books, it harms people, and the expanding definition of what is racist, or what do we say is actually racism, whereas those were just depictions that were perfectly acceptable during the time he wrote them. We've evolved from then. He evolved after that, and no longer would that be acceptable now. That's fine. We can look back at that and say, here's a good story with a moral in it, but also here's another moral. Here's another, look at what he could draw back then without getting in trouble. But look at the way things are now, we're much more accepting. Look how far we've gone. People are afraid to look how far we've gone because that takes away from the argument of let's tear everything down. And so the second thing that's dangerous here is when you start seeing it as actual activism versus compassion. If you're one of the compassionate in those groups, you see it as actual activism. There's a purpose to why they pick Dr. Seuss, and just doing it in general. They're picking the things you love, that Americans love, on purpose, and the more ridiculous, the better, because the more people you're going to get fired up over. 91% of the US says, why are you doing this? Now the activists can say, look, America's systemically racist, because they want to protect this racist thing. So that's the Bailey, racism, or the Mott. I keep getting these backwards. That's the Mott, is the racism. Then they go out into the Bailey again, make another attack. And when you push them back to the Mott, to the safe home, you're all racist. Why'd you attack that? You attacked me. Kaepernick was the same.
Yep.
Protest American flag, systemic racism. No, you offended a lot of people. Well, that's because they're racist. There's a big when we're looking at where all these activists are going down these roads, there's an ultimate goal that doesn't look, that it is actually a very, very, very bad thing. And we start seeing it in the legislation that's coming out. What's the narrative for the last 10 years? The ultimate narrative with racism, the systemic stuff. What's the ultimate narrative?
I'm curious where you're going with this, but my thought is that
Why is America bad?
because America was founded on evil, and therefore all of the structures, the systems that were founded by the founders need to be torn down, need to be ignored or torn down so we can put totally new ones in place to make things equitable and fair.
What is being touted as the biggest threat to the United States?
Right now, it's white supremacy and insurrection.
White supremacist, domestic terrorists.
Mm-hmm.
The biggest threat. That's the ultimate narrative. But we also have the ever expanding definition of what it is to be a white supremacist, including multi-ethnic white supremacists or multicultural white supremacists.
I haven't heard that one.
What they're saying, black people that are conservative.
So this is how you call Steele a racist.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's this is USA Today. This is mainstream media. This isn't some fly-by-night random person or even a BLM organizer. Multi-ethnic white supremacist. That's what because that's how they're coming after the Proud Boys, because they're founded by a Cuban black man and all kinds of stuff like that. So the ever-expanding definition of white supremacy, the ever-expanding definition of harm, the ever-expanding definition of racism is leading down the path to where at some point, people like us, people like Granny, who just wants to live her life and be nice to everybody, is a domestic terrorist.
Mm-hmm.
And then you got domestic terrorism bills that are trying to be passed on the floor. And I think it first came up in 2016, but they re-brought it back after the January 6th stuff, where it's basically Patriot Act 2.0 on steroids, but for quote unquote domestic white supremacist terrorism. And somebody said, "Oh, that's 2016. You're just bringing something back up." I read the thing, and on the list of examples was Kyle Rittenhouse. Unless we got some profits in our Congress in 2016, that thing's been re-upped.
Yeah. And lest you think we go too far, that reminds me of the other thing from that Jordan Peterson interview that jumped out at me is he was talking about the examples of, basically cancel culture and things like that was already happening in 2018. And the journalist was guffawing that he was being an extremist, and one of the points he made was people being jailed for jokes, and she laughed and said, "Are you serious?" And he looked at her and said, "It's literally already happened." And so what he was referring to, and he talked about, was this YouTuber who went by the name Count Dankula, and he was in Great Britain. I think he was in Scotland, and his girlfriend had this pug that he hated. He did not like this dog, and so he thought it would be funny if he taught this dog to do a Nazi salute. And he was literally put in jail. I don't remember if it was for hate speech or what the exact violation was they got him, but it was a joke. You can think it wasn't funny. You can think it was in poor taste. You can think it was dumb, but it was a joke, teaching a dog to do a Nazi salute. And this guy was put in jail in Britain, not in some third world hellhole for making a joke. And the journalist, her reaction was really chilling, because she went, "Well," and basically it boiled down to, Well, I didn't think it was meant in fun. I didn't think it was a joke. So you get to decide what is or isn't a joke. So based on your idea of what is in good taste, you can send people to jail. I mean, that's what we're headed for. That's what not what we're headed for. That's what we're doing.
Mhm.
And now you're passing a bill that adds all sorts of teeth to this authoritarian idea.
Well, yeah, couple that with a lot of things. They're like, we should rethink freedom of speech. Couple that with calls for rethinking the Second Amendment. This is not a doom and gloom. This is just I think, a pretty factual statement. When it comes to
Yeah.
the American people, mess with their free speech, you're going to get a lot of complaining. Start taking away their guns, they're going to start shooting.
Yep. Yep. And I have a a, a good historical example for this, since we are talking about racial issues. Okay, so as I mentioned before, one of the things that annoys me about the postmodernist philosophy and all of its various tentacles, it's nothing new. Um, there were people who were actually on the side of good, who thought America was founded on evil and it needed to be destroyed. Um, One of the more prominent ones was a guy named William Lloyd Garrison, who was one of the most vocal leaders of the abolitionist movement of the mid 1800s. And like a lot of abolitionists at the time, he thought the problem was the U.S. Constitution. He thought the U.S. Constitution needed to be, basically amended so much you might as well throw it out, because the U.S. Constitution is what was facilitating the evil of slavery. So much so that in one of his more infamous public speeches, actually, I think he did this on more than one occasion, he would take a copy of the U.S. Constitution and burn it. In much the same way that 60s radicals burnt the U.S. flag. Well, one of the greatest Americans to ever live, I think, was Frederick Douglass, and he was basically taught by William Lloyd Garrison when he first escaped to freedom and rose to prominence, and became a mover in the abolitionist movement. But then he got to reading and thinking on his own, and he realized that actually, no, the Constitution doesn't protect slavery. It's one, it's silent on the question, and two, uh, all people, white or black, needed those structures and those founding principles of liberty and equality in order to protect them, in order to secure their natural rights. So that if you throw out the Constitution, you leave everybody open to injustice, not just the black men who were enslaved. And he made a lot of great points on the subject. If you go to there's a Frederick Douglass Foundation, and they've got a lot of his writings online, and that's basically what the Lincoln Douglas debates were about, which most people know the names, but they haven't actually read. Basically, Lincoln's point was, no, the Constitution didn't protect slavery, and that was the problem with the Fugitive Slave Act and the Dred Scott decision, is it imposed slavery essentially on free states. It took it out of the South and imposed it everywhere because of those acts. And as we've kind of talked about, the whole course of human history basically has been violence and horribleness, and that was the point of the founders. If you go back and you read their debates, there weren't really stringent disagreements between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists and the various camps of thought around the founding. They were all focused on what is the best way to ensure that what has always happened through human history doesn't happen here. That's the point of our founding documents and why they are necessary and why we ignore them or destroy them at our own peril.
Yeah, and the American experiment, just keep repeating it. It was set up in a way to create an environment where normal human tendencies have trouble manifesting in an authoritarian way. You talk about socialization. If these movements are successful, one of the naughty words we talked about with Kendi was assimilation. If these movements are successful, everyone's going to have to assimilate because everything will be so different. That's part of the point on the activists, is they want everybody to be on a level playing field, even if the playing field is running through sand, you know. So everyone's quote unquote equal. But the problem is, as we alluded to earlier, the powerful people, the people with influence, the people with resources will take control. And I think, again, I think we'll end up with a bigger gap than we have now. Now, we do need to be working on that gap. That's the, I mean, 10 years ago, that was the idea. We need to be working on that gap and continuing to improve. Like I brought up the crime numbers, we need to keep working on that. Incarceration rates, we need to keep working on that. And they're slow processes. Most people incarcerated, we brought up the war on drugs, but realistically, most people incarcerated are for violent crimes. They have longer sentences. And so when you have a longer sentence, you make improvements over time. Well, that improvement in the jails, in the prison systems can go down slower because some people from a time before are still there. So we have to give some things time. Now, I am more optimistic than a lot of people are on the timeline for reversing this course because it happened so fast. It was like a flash fire. We could put it out in a lot of ways. Now, there's going to be some healing from it. There's going to be some repair from it, but I think the initial changes could be relatively quick. And unfortunately, as a country, we need. We've been poked along for a long time, and a certain community has been poked for a long time in a big way, and it's got to be some sort of kind of nationwide cognitive behavioral psychology, you know, cognitive behavioral change, where you expose yourself to the idea of something different. So when we talk about the Black community, we have about 2 generations that probably need to check their unconscious mind on what they feel. Like, what is a microaggression? That person looked at me funny. Automatically, I'm triggered. Well, they've been conditioned to do that for a long time. You know, that cop pulled me over and he moved a little fast. You have to take a step back and cognitively start training yourself. But at the same time, the second part of that is teaching your children that it doesn't have to be that way. In fact, hey, look how great things are. You're in the greatest country in the world to be Black, if you really think about it. I'll look up that quote later, but it was a quote on how to retrain your unconscious mind from a neurobiology standpoint, and it's all from the prefrontal cortex. You have to take a step back and think things through again and again and again, and slowly expose yourself to the opposite of what you want to react to. So I lost my train of thought on that because I was thinking about that quote. But we've been, you know, we just got to summarize everything. We've been poked for a long time to think a certain way, and it culminated in the last 10 years in a lot of ways for all those different varying reasons. And I really think that just the idea of the postmodern and the critical race theory, and again, this goes along with all the marginalized groups, is part of the problem. And as we saw with the crime numbers, a large part of the problem. And higher crime numbers also leads to higher incarceration rates. So we talk about one group targeting others more, they're going to have a higher rate of arrest, higher rate of interaction, higher rate of incarceration, all of those things. And that's where you normalize the data, and that's where the disproportional numbers get thrown off.
And we can't have rational discussions about why those numbers are so different if the counter argument is always you're racist, you're defending racism. Now on the other side of that is, and I'm supposed to be the token right guy, but I see what I did there. One of the problems the right has had is basically kind of not acknowledging the particularly difficult situations and history of the Black community in America. And I mean, you see these memes about, like, you know, how abused the Irish were, and you don't see them asking for stuff because they're not wussies or whatever. You see memes like that. And okay, well, yeah, other communities in America did have a really crappy time of it. The Irish, the Italians, the Jews, the Chinese, none of them were kept as chattel slaves for 200, 300 years. And then had a whole host of laws written around completely negating their natural rights as citizens. So you do have to acknowledge the unique position, and then also the abuse, like you were talking about, of what the powers that be have been telling people in that community for so long. You have got to acknowledge that, or you can't connect, and you'll never be able to have a productive conversation with someone.
Well, there's two things. There's creating the problem that you want to complain about. So in the activist side, they're creating the trouble they want to complain about. And again, you make a young 16-year-old Black kid afraid of being pulled over. Well, 16-year-olds do stupid stuff behind the wheel all the time, so they will be pulled over. And now he's anxious, cop's anxious, interplay back and forth, something bad could happen. Someone's been trained by the activists to get everything in a cop interaction on film. And so eventually you're going to get a video. The fact that it took so long to get a George Floyd video is actually a testament to how little that stuff happens, because this big push has been since 2013 on. BLM's message of basically don't, resist arrest, basically be obnoxious to police officers and get it on film, to summarize their philosophy from the beginning they've been spreading. And then the other part is the right's reaction to it plays into it. It's very, again, they studied this stuff. They know how to make you angry. So I'm gonna make two appeals to close us out here. The first appeal is to the liberals on the left, the real liberals, not the far left crazies. The real liberals on the left is know that internally you do have something in your brain that could make you sacrifice 100 people for that one person you want to have compassion for. Whatever marker you put on that one person, and being a US citizen, we are conditioned to put that on race over time, because of our history, because of that bad history you talked about, all the way up until the 1960s and then beyond, because there was a lot of adjustment period in the 70s and 80s and 90s, and that actually reflects in those numbers. The adjustment period, just in people's, there was no policy. It was just people's attitudes that led to those numbers. And that's the whole point of this whole podcast, I think. But the second appeal is to the right. Quit reacting like that. You're making it worse. Half the time I spend on social media now is just saying, hey, everybody, take a deep breath. Hey, everybody, relax. This is what they want you to do. This big, long Dr. Seuss thread. I was like, this is what they want you to do. This is why they did this. This is why they quit. And then right after I said that, you can have a trans woman reading to kids, but you can't have Dr. Seuss, blah, 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 blah. And it just keeps going back and forth, and relax. So the appeal to the left is know that you have this tendency, and call out those on your side that are using it to their advantage. And the appeal to the right is quit reacting that way. Take a step back and say, learn the language. Learn the language. Say, I know what you're doing here. This is what you want me to say. What you're doing is wrong. And let's talk about the nuance behind it instead of just reacting with a meme, or again, the mimetic propagators, the general human intelligence. Take a step back, point out why they're doing what they're doing, and then take the conversation from there instead of just reacting angrily. Doesn't mean you can't be angry, just be calm.
Especially if it's not something that actually affects you. That's so you brought up the drag queen reading hour, which was, for anyone who doesn't know, that was like a Portland thing. I don't remember what it was. It was at a public library and it caused all sorts of outrage. And I don't remember who I first heard say this, probably Jonah Goldberg, that one of the downsides to the internet and the 24-hour news cycle is that one of the many downsides is that every story is national. So back in the days of newspapers, no one would have heard about that outside of the town where it happened. And then if they wanted to be outraged, then they would be outraged. What the heck does it matter to you if you're living in Midland, Texas, what the people in Portland, Oregon are doing? That's their life. Okay, if you hear about it, you can roll your eyes, but then move on with your life. Save your energy for things that actually affect you. Save the national discussion for things that are actually national issues.
Well, let's get back to the day where people had improper thoughts in their head, but if they didn't act on it, okay.
Yeah.
And then we come down harder on the people who act on it.
Yeah.
We don't just try to look for different ways that it might be present in the systems. No, people, Shelby Steele. I'm quoting Shelby Steele, so nobody clip me here. I have racist thoughts, but I also have to know that it's unacceptable to act on them.
Mm-hmm.
And we could say that about anything. You could have a misogynistic thought for a moment. You can roll your eyes at the trans person, like you said, but don't act on it. That's it. And we can all live happily ever after. And that's where we're seeing the disparity in the crime numbers. Tenfold one way versus a very small number the other way. We do have those individuals that they're just not acting on it because it will come down hard on them. Now we've got to create an environment on the other side which doesn't justify or perpetuate acting on those thoughts, because some of those are unconscious. And so ask yourself, is this what I'm seeing in this news story, or this study someone's trying to show me, or this class where the teacher's talking at me, is this designed to appeal to my elephant, or is this designed to appeal to my rider?
Mm-hmm.
Because right now, some people who want to, I brought up the socialist chart. America doesn't want socialism, but people want it to happen. And they're using this tribal mentality to make something the country doesn't want a policy.
Right.
And realistically, one of the analogies that's in my head, and again, this is why you can call me wrong, but you can't call me racist, is look at an analogy of a bullet and a gun, or a bullet and a shooter. The black community is the bullets. The person holding the gun itself is someone like Ibram X. Kendi, or Robin DiAngelo, or even the Reverend Al Sharpton, or somebody up there. They're pulling the trigger. The black community is the bullet. Yeah, it may kill the white guy on the other side, but the bullet's never the same once it's shot. And if you miss, the bullet never survives. Whether the shooter hits or misses their target, the bullet never survives. So if I'm going to place my compassion, it's going to be over that thing that has no choice in the matter, unless they refuse to be the bullet.
Refuse to be the bullet. It's a good place to end on.
Good place to end. Refuse to be the bullet.